Was Red Bull lying throughout the Dutch GP? If you look at it from the side, the way Red Bull handled its driver strategies in the Dutch Grand Prix was weird to say the least, and it definitely upset some people. However, the reason they gave for that after the race was ridiculous, and this is an understatement, even though the way Perez ended the race was his fault only. Was Red Bull actually lying about this in the press conference, and is this favoritism we are seeing or something else? Max Verstappen secured his third consecutive victory at the Dutch Grand Prix as anticipated, but at one point his Red Bull colleague Sergio Perez held a significant 15-second lead over him. This was due to Perez making the right tyre decision early on, switching to intermediates after the initial lap, while Verstappen and others remained on slicks amidst the intensifying rain. After overtaking Pierre Gasly's Alpine and Zhou Guanyu's Alfa Romeo, Verstappen swiftly closed the gap to Perez. However, Red Bull decided to pit Verstappen first to switch back to slicks, and by the time Perez pitted a lap later, he rejoined the race behind Verstappen. Upon re-entry, Perez expressed his confusion over the team radio, questioning if Max undercut them in a puzzled tone. So was this unfair on Perez indeed, or did he have a straight-up bad race? It certainly fits the narrative of recent seasons since the Miami Grand Prix, where he's consistently been the second best in terms of one-lap pace, and his races haven't been as impeccable or as striking. Helmut Marko's had some interesting comments about him during the Dutch GP weekend, saying that Perez's seat is not guaranteed next year, even though Horner has been adamant in saying the opposite. This situation with Helmut Marko was rather entertaining, as it felt reminiscent of Marko just being himself, doing the typical things he does. However, as much as he follows his own set of rules, I don't believe Marko says things just for the sake of it, and there's usually a reason behind his comments. Intriguingly, in two separate interviews with different publications prior to the race weekend, he mentioned they want to retain Checo for 2024, but it wasn't a certainty. To my knowledge, this might be the first time anyone at Red Bull even hinted that he could be let go for the next year, countering the season's prevailing narrative. Yet after qualifying, Marko slightly backtracked in another interview, confirming that Checo will indeed remain for the upcoming year. It's curious because since the summer break, following his consecutive podium finishes that boosted his contention for second in the World Championship, Checo hasn't made any significant moves. He hasn't stumbled, yet Marko seemed to question his future. This was followed by an unremarkable qualifying performance and a challenging Grand Prix. Surprisingly, his position was then strongly reinforced. It's quite perplexing how the conversation about his future suddenly resurfaced and was then quickly dismissed, and what's undeniable about Marko is that whether you agree with his comments or not, he tends to be candid in his public statements. There's often a core truth in his words, even if he's occasionally prompted to temper the flames he's ignited. What was weird about the race was how did Verstappen manage to catch Perez so quickly on the wet tyres, being faster than him for full 4 seconds at one lap? To be honest, the difference between drivers in wet conditions can be significantly magnified, and the difference between Perez and Verstappen is already a big one. It's not just about how fast a driver can maneuver the car as in dry conditions, but more about the connection and feel they have with the vehicle. In the wet, a slight misjudgment can lead to the car skidding off the track in a split second, and consequently the distinctions between drivers are even more pronounced in wet conditions, so it's not uncommon for a faster driver to be considerably quicker in the wet compared to an average driver. This difference was evident in the early wet laps on the intermediates. Verstappen had a mission and executed it, while Perez was trying his best to establish a lead, navigating through the other cars. I'm convinced that if you switched their cars, you'd observe the same performance pattern, with Max outpacing Checo in the wet. This is because Perez is simply a worse driver than Max Verstappen, as you cannot lose 4 seconds against anyone with a car like the RB19 and make mistakes like he did, hitting the wall in the pit lane. At first we thought that, alright, these are all mistakes Perez makes, but at some point you have to stand up and say that Checo Perez is simply a not good enough driver to compete against Max Verstappen, and that the Dutch driver can beat him comfortably at any track. On top of that, Perez's performance in the wet isn't just about this season. Historically, by F1 standards, he's been decent but not exceptional in wet conditions. Betting on him to excel in such situations might be a risk, as some drivers inherently find wet races more challenging. What I found very weird, however, is Horner stating that Red Bull were afraid of Albon and Alonso undercutting Max, so that is why they pitted him before Perez, which is a statement that, even if you are not an avid Formula 1 fan, would seem ridiculous in these set of circumstances. Speaking after the race, Red Bull team boss Christian Horner said it was an easy choice. The way he, Verstappen, cut through the traffic was quite sensational, Horner said after the race, when the race's Mark Hughes asked him about the decision. Checo had the target to pull the gap on the cars behind him, but Max's pace as he came through the field was such that at one point he took 7 seconds out of him over 3 laps, and was coming very fast. Then you get to that awkward point at the crossover, and Fernando Alonso and Pierre Gasly behind him had pulled the trigger after to switch to slicks. You could see from Albon on slicks that the circuit was coming alive for the slicks, so had we pitted Checo first, they would have both undercut Max, so we'd have gone from a net 1-2 to a net 1-4. So we pitted Max first with the risk that he'd undercut Checo, but we'd end up as a team first and second. It was a no-brainer. Had the positions been swapped, there is absolutely zero chance the same validation would have applied. However, this is a hypothetical scenario, picturing Perez outpacing Verstappen by 4 seconds per lap and erasing a significant lead seems far-fetched. If, for argument's sake, Verstappen had led the race with Perez trailing and both Alonso and Gasly close behind, it's almost certain Red Bull would have opted to pit Verstappen first. The potential for Alonso to undercut was genuine, as demonstrated later when he kept pace with the Red Bulls and capitalized on any errors. Yet, given Verstappen's noticeable speed advantage and the evident passing opportunities on the track, he had plenty of laps to reclaim positions. I think it's funny that Red Bull are afraid of a very weak car in the Williams and an Aston Martin who, to be honest, will hardly even get the chance of catching Verstappen in a Red Bull. Simply put, Max could have had a drink in his cockpit and still won the race, so the argument of being afraid of those two drivers undercutting Max is outrageous. Perez and his fans certainly have grounds for disappointment, as his savvy call to pit on the initial lap, a move he led, produced positive results. Some might contend that this move rightfully earned him the lead driver position, yet his claim that he could have maintained the lead longer with better weather insights simply doesn't hold up, especially considering Verstappen's typical advantage in similar conditions. While Perez might have retained the lead for an extended period, and an earlier call for slicks from Red Bull could have assisted this, Verstappen was poised to be the definitive Red Bull victor in that race. The concept of deserving seems doubtful in this context. Red Bull's objective is clear: win every race and every title, and Verstappen is their primary asset to achieve that. It was merely another instance showcasing Red Bull's strategic priorities during races, and who can fault them when there are moments when one driver consistently outperforms the other by a significant margin. Whether or not Perez will be in a Red Bull car next year is anyone's guess. We can see doubts from Marko starting to surface, and while Horner still is adamant in keeping Perez for 2024, should the Mexican continue like this, I do believe he and Marko will have a conversation about him soon enough, but let's wait and see how this one develops. What do you think? Will Perez stay in Red Bull if he continues like this, or will he get the sack 1 year before the expiration of his contract? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.